The story told about the Americas begins the same way in every classroom. A frozen bridge of land stretching from Siberia to Alaska, a band of wandering hunters stepping into an untouched world, and a long predictable march southward until the continent's filled with tribes. It is a clean story, a convenient story one that fits perfectly into timelines, charts, and tidy academic diagrams. But the deeper you listen to the land itself, the more this tale begins to strain at its seams. In the quiet spaces between accepted dates and carefully curated museum labels, whispers rise like wind through broken reeds. They tell of footprints older than human migration should allow, tools forged in a darkness before memory, and skulls that vanished the moment they were uncovered. They tell of a past, too wide, too strange, too ancient, to be contained inside a single tidy narrative. Tonight, we stand at the threshold of that buried reality. And if the official story is a house of cards built upon convenience, then we begin at the moment a single breath threatens to bring it tumbling down. For generations, we were taught that nothing existed here before 13,000 years ago. No cities, no voyagers, no cultures, beyond the barest survival. But the earth has begun to speak, and the earth does not lie. It offers evidence in the form of hearths burned 50,000 years before humans supposedly arrived. It offers bones that tower, tools that predate our species, and monuments whose designs echo civilizations across the sea. Each discovery is a crack in the wall, and together they silently spell a truth no one wished to read. Yet the institutions built to protect our understanding of the past seem to move in the opposite direction, not toward wonder, but toward containment. A strange thing happens when a discovery does not fit the accepted timeline. Museums misplace artifacts, reports are filed in locked cabinets, careers dissolve in ridicule, and the story resets itself as if nothing had ever happened. The official narrative remains immaculate while the anomalies are quietly swept beneath it like dust gathering below an ornate rug. But what if those anomalies aren't exceptions? What if they are the first glimpses of a forgotten world? The more one studies the deepest layers of the Americas, the more the land begins to resemble a palimpsestan, ancient manuscript written, erased, overwritten, and rewritten again. In Nevada, legends speak of a race of towering, pale-skinned giants whose red hair glowed like embers. In Brazil, the remnants of ancient fire circles burn through impossible dates. In Mexico, spear points pushed human presence back, not by centuries but by hundreds of thousands of years. And scattered across the continent, the remnants of colossal cities rise like the vertebrae of sleeping beasts too advanced, too aligned with stars, too deliberate to belong to a story of simple hunters walking across an ice bridge. If early humans came here late and alone, how do we explain temples aligned with Orion before Egypt carved its first stone? How do we explain cities built atop portals into the underworld long before there was a written word? How do we explain roads stretching straight across the desert for dozens of miles, when the people who built them supposedly had neither beasts of burden nor wheels? At every turn, the evidence argues not for isolation, but for connection oceanic, celestial, and technological. The ancient Americas were not a blank slate waiting to be discovered. They were a world of deep complexity, living links in a chain of cultures whose edges reach far beyond the horizon. Perhaps that is why the story had to be simplified. Because the truth is not gentle, it does not sit quietly in textbooks. It expands, it spills outward, it rewrites everything. Imagine, for a moment, a world before continents were separated by fear, a world where travelers followed currents instead of borders, where knowledge passed across oceans like drifting seeds, a world where the first feet to touch American soil may not have belonged to Homo sapiens, where entire civilizations rose and fell before the ancestors of modern humans arrived. Imagine a world where the past does not move in a straight line, but spirals like a nautilus shell, repeating its patterns across time and sea. If even a fraction of what lies buried beneath the sands and jungles is true, then the accepted timeline is no more than a comfortable illusion. And illusions, however comforting, crumble the moment one dares to examine the foundation. Tonight, we peel back that illusion slowly, carefully, like lifting the skin of an old drum to reveal the hollow chamber beneath. What remains is not a clear answer, but an echo, a resonance that grows stronger the deeper one listens. Perhaps the greatest deception was not in the evidence that was hidden, but in the question we were trained never to ask. What if the first Americans were not who we think they were? And what if this land remembers more than the world is willing to admit? The journey that follows is not an attempt to replace one simple story with another. It is an invitation to step beyond the familiar, to stand before mysteries older than our species, and to follow the faint trails left by civilizations that refuse to vanish completely. In the stones, in the caves, in the drowned structures beneath the sea, their voices linger like distant drums calling across time. Follow them long enough, and the world you thought you knew begins to unravel. What you find beyond that unraveling is not a single truth, but a doorway. A door into a continent whose past is stranger, older, and far more interconnected than any official chronicle dares to acknowledge. And so our story begins, not with what we were taught, but with what the land remembers. Night settles differently in the Nevada desert. It does not arrive, it descends thick, deliberate, like a curtain being drawn across the stage of a forgotten play. and somewhere in that expanse of quiet stone and wind, a dark opening yawns in the limestone as if the mountain itself is exhaling an ancient secret. Lovelock Cave is small, unassuming, almost mundane at first glance. Yet for more than a century, it has been the fissure through which an older world has whispered into our own. Long before the archaeologists came, before the miners with their shovels and lanterns, the Paiute people told a story that should have been impossible. They spoke of the Satakatha, Tule eaters, a race of towering, pale-skinned beings, with hair the color of burning clay. These giants were not the benevolent titans of European myth. They were remembered as brutal, cannibalistic enemies, hunters of flesh rather than game. According to legend, the ancestors of the Paiute waged war against them for generations, driving them across the desert until the final survivors were cornered in a single cavern. The story ends in fire. The Paiute piled brush at the cave's mouth, ignited it, and watched as the smoke swallowed the giants whole. The screams faded, the flames died, and the cave sealed its dead in silence. For the tribe, it was a tale of survival, a warning carried down the centuries. For the rest of the world, it was a myth, nothing more. But myths only remain myths until the earth begins to speak. In 1911, two miners searching for guano fertilizer, not history, forced their way into the mouth of Lovelock Cave, with nothing more profound in mind than profit. Yet as they shoveled through layers of compacted droppings, something unexpected began to rise from the dust. First came baskets woven with uncanny skill, so refined and well-preserved they appeared almost modern. Then duck decors crafted with such realism they seemed capable of taking flight. Thousands of objects emerged, each more intricate than the last. And then came the bones. The miners described them later with a tone that wavered somewhere between awe and fear. Human remains, but not like any they had ever seen. They spoke of skeletons that stretched 7 feet, perhaps 8. They spoke of skulls with thick brows, massive jaws, proportions just slightly wrong. And above all, they spoke of hair tufts, still clinging to mummified scalps, hair that flashed unmistakably red in the lantern light. When the University of California sent archaeologists the following year, the official documentation would paint a very different picture. Their reports were clinical, cautious, stripped of anything that might unsettle the accepted timeline. Yes, human remains were discovered. Yes, some hair had a reddish hue. No, nothing was out of the ordinary. They attributed the red color to age, minerals, time. But the bones, the miners described the largest and most anomalous of them, were nowhere to be found. And that is where the first shadow lengthens. Because the disappearance of inconvenient skeletons is a recurring motif in the archaeology of the Americas. Over the next decades, whispers began to circulate that the Smithsonian Institution had quietly acquired the remains. Some said the bones were sealed in crates and buried in storage. Others claimed they were destroyed outright. There is no proof. There is no paper trail. Only a conspicuous absence that mirrors to many other stories. The official record insists that no giant bones were ever recovered, that the miners exaggerated, mismeasured, misunderstood. Yet their accounts remained consistent until their deaths, and independent visitors from the era reported the same unsettling proportions. The cave itself offers clues: oversized handprints impressed into the rock, sandals measuring 15 inches long, remnants of tools that suggest hands far larger than those of the average ancient inhabitant. And still, the official narrative refuses to bend. But the strange thing about Lovelock Cave is that the more you stare into its darkness, the more it seems to stare back. The baskets and decoys, objects of artistry unmatched elsewhere in the region, suggest a people of advanced skill and specialized craft. The bones, if they ever existed, hint at a physiology that does not fit neatly within the expected progression of human settlement. But the most unsettling detail is not the artifacts themselves. It is the way the story splits in two, cleanly, sharply, like a bone broken under pressure. On one side, the myth, the miner's testimony, the vanished remains, the oversized artifacts; on the other, the official record, smoothed like river stone, stripped of anomaly, polished until nothing out of place remains. Where these two narratives collide, one cannot help but ask, who benefits from the simpler version? Perhaps the greatest mystery is why the story of the Sitica refuses to fade. Legends of giants span the Americas, from the red-haired Danavis of the Andes to the Starns of the Great Lakes. Across continents, cultures isolated by miles and centuries speak of tall, pale beings who arrived first and vanished last. Stories rarely survive unchanged unless tethered to some deep memory, some buried truth. Standing before Lovelock Cave today, wind whispering through the desert, the entrance no longer seems like a gap in stone. It seems like a scar, one left by a forgotten conflict, half remembered in myth, half remembered in official archives. A wound in the earth where two histories meet but do not reconcile. And perhaps that is why this cave matters. Because it is not simply a curiosity or a footnote, it is a fracture. A place where the accepted past and the remembered past cannot be stitched together without leaving a seam. And through that seam, the questions slip like cold air. Who were the first to walk this land? Where did they come from? And why do the stories of their existence vanish the moment we try to bring them into the light? Tonight, we step deeper into that darkness not to find giants, but to understand why someone may have wished for them never to be found at all. There are places on this continent where time seems to pool like water collecting in quiet hollows, seeping into stone, refusing to flow forward with the rest of history. Pedra Ferrada is one of those places, a sun-baked rock shelter deep within Brazil's Serra da Capivara National Park. It looks unremarkable at first glance. A shallow cave, streaked with soot and ochre, perched above a valley of twisted scrubland, yet beneath that modest surface lies a truth so old, so disquieting, that decades of scholars have tried to explain it away as an illusion, as if the earth itself had played a trick. But the earth does not play tricks, only people do. When the first excavations began here, archaeologists expected the usual story: some pottery, some tools, perhaps a hearth from 10 or 12,000 years ago. Instead, they found fire. Charcoal clustered in tight circular patches, not scattered by nature, but arranged in the unmistakable shape of ancient hearths. Then came flakes of quartzite, shaped with crisp, purposeful edges, scrapers, choppers, cutting tools, artifacts that bore the deliberate marks of hands at work. But when those layers were sent for radiocarbon testing, the numbers that came back read like typographical errors. 32,000 years, 48,000 years, and in deeper layers, still 56,000. 56,000 years. Older than the Clovis hunters by nearly 40,000 years. Older than the accepted arrival of Homo sapiens in the Americas. Older than the supposed human trek across the land bridge. It would mean people lived, worked, and cooked in Brazil long before the textbooks claim humans even left Africa. And that is a truth some people were not ready to face. The archaeological establishment reacted like a body struck by cold water, tensing, recoiling, insisting there must be some mistake. Critics argued the tools were not tools at all, merely rocks shattered by falling from nearby cliffs. Geofacts, not artifacts. The charcoal, they claimed, came from natural fires. The hearths were coincidences. The layers had been disturbed. Anything was wrong. But those counter-arguments crack the moment one steps into the shelter itself. Natural fires do not burn in perfect circular patches beneath a protective overhang. Falling rocks do not scatter themselves neatly around the places where food would have been cooked. Nature does not create living spaces. Humans do. And then there is the art. Far above the oldest hearths, painted high on the cave walls, are scenes preserved in pigments of crimson and black, hunters in motion, animals mid-stride, figures dancing beneath the sun. Some of these images may be 30,000 years old, an artistic record layered atop a much older human presence. The paintings do not belong to nature, they belong to memory. Yet the controversy around Pedra Ferrada did not subside. It intensified because to accept its age is to tear apart the tidy narrative of human migration, the one built on straight arrows and simple diagrams. If humans were in Brazil 50,000 years ago, then the land bridge model collapses, the timeline collapses, everything collapses. And so the establishment dug its heels into the sand, insisting that extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. But perhaps the more honest question is, why do extraordinary discoveries provoke extraordinary resistance? Pedra Ferrada does not stand alone. Across the continent, other impossible sites echo its chronology. At Monte Verde, in Chile, tools and organic remains date back to nearly 18,000 years, long considered heresy, until the evidence became too overwhelming to deny. At White Sands in New Mexico, fossilized footprints now push human presence back to 23,000 years. Slowly, reluctantly, the official story is bending. But the deeper layers, the ones measured not in tens of thousands but in hundreds of thousands of years, remain locked behind the gate of academic disbelief. But Pedra Ferrada continues to burn. Its hearths remain, its stones remain, its charcoal remains. The sediment refuses to lie, and in that refusal lies a question that hums like a low drumbeat in the dark. If humans were not supposed to be here, then who lit these fires? Were they early humans, Homo sapiens, who crossed oceans instead of ice bridges? Or were they another kind of human entirely, one whose existence has been erased by time and buried beneath layers of scientific caution? Stone tools of similar ages have been found across Africa and Eurasia, dating to a period when multiple human species walked the earth: Neanderthals, Denisovans, and others yet unnamed. Could one of them have crossed the ocean long before us? It sounds impossible, yet so does a hearth burning 56,000 years ago. Perhaps the greatest mystery of Pedra Ferrada is not the age of its artifacts, but the reaction they provoke. Evidence that does not fit the accepted framework is not embraced, but brushed aside. Studies that challenge the timeline are labeled controversial. Careers are quietly dismantled. Funding dries up. The truth becomes a burden that too many are unwilling to carry. But the land carries it anyway. Stand inside Pedra Ferrada at dusk, and you can almost feel the echo of those ancient fires. The air grows still. The walls darken. The rock shelter becomes a chamber of memory, a place where the past presses close, whispering through the cracks. You sense the presence of hands long turned to dust, hands that shaped these stones, tended these flames, left their mark long before the world was ready to believe they existed. The story of humanity in the Americas did not begin with the Bering Land Bridge. It did not begin with Clovis spear points. It did not begin with the neat lines drawn in textbooks. It began with fire. Fire older than our species. Fire that still smolders in the stones of this forgotten shelter. And once you have seen that fire, you cannot unsee it. You can only follow it deeper into the next impossible layer, into the next forbidden discovery, and into the next unanswered question waiting just beyond the edges of approved history. If Pedro Ferrada was a spark flickering against the darkness of accepted history, then the deserts of California and the volcanic fields of central Mexico are where that spark began to glow into something fiercer and ember that refused to die. Here, scattered across dry basins and ancient lake beds, lies a constellation of sites so old, so disruptive, that entire careers were sacrificed in the attempt to bring them into the light. These are the places where the timeline of human presence does not bend, it shatters. The Calico Early Man site is one of them. At first glance it seems unremarkable, a lonely archaeological dig outside Barstow, little more than a series of pits and trenches cut into a barren hillside. But beneath that dust lies a story that even the most celebrated scientists struggled to tell. Louis Leakey, the same paleoanthropologist whose work in Africa helped shape the modern understanding of human origins, came to Calico late in his career. He did not come chasing fame, he had that already. He came because the stones whispered something he couldn't ignore. Leakey examined the quartzite flakes, emerging from the site objects fractured with such precision that, to his eye, they bore the unmistakable marks of deliberate craftsmanship. Not geologic accident, not random breakage, tools embedded in strata, more than 200,000 years old. That date was unthinkable. According to every accepted model, Homo sapiens had not even evolved yet. Humanity as we know it was still a dream waiting in the bones of earlier species. And yet here were stones that suggested not only presence, but skill, intelligence, intent. Leakey's conclusion was simple in its audacity. Some kind of human, not necessarily our kind, had lived and worked in the Mojave Desert hundreds of thousands of years before any migration into the Americas was supposed to occur. The backlash was immediate. Colleagues called the tools geofacts, mere rocks, dressed in the costume of artifacts. Journals refused publication. The academic world closed ranks, and Calico, for all its promise, was pushed to the margins. When Leakey died, the site was quietly dismissed as an error of a once great mind in decline, but the stones remained silent, stubborn, awkward pieces that refused to fit the puzzle we insist must be complete. Far to the south, in the Valsequillo Basin of Puebla, Mexico, another anomaly took shape, this one even more radical. Geological surveys in the 1960s unearthed stone tools in association with the remains of extinct megafauna mastodons, ancient camels, the great beasts of a world long gone. Smithsonian geologist Virginia Stain McIntyre was among those who examined the site. She did not approach it as a crusader, nor as a theorist hungry for headlines. She approached it as a scientist, wielding the most advanced dating techniques available at the time: uranium series analysis, fission track dating, and tephrochronology. The results converged with chilling clarity. The artifacts did not belong to the late Pleistocene. They belonged to a world 250,000 years old. 250,000 years, a number so vast it makes the Bering Land Bridge look like a recent footpath. A number that pushes the first American toolmakers into a time when Neanderthals were just beginning to take shape in Europe, when Homo erectus still wandered across Asia. If Pedro Ferrada opened a crack in the timeline, Valsequillo blew a hole straight through it, and the cost was immediate. Stain McIntyre's paper was blocked from publication, grants evaporated, positions were withdrawn. A promising career was crushed beneath the weight of a discovery no one wished to confront. Eventually, she stepped away from the mainstream entirely, her findings becoming another ghost in the vast graveyard of inconvenient evidence. Yet the site itself never changed. The tools remain embedded in ash from the same volcanic eruptions that dated them. The bones remain fossilized in the same sediments. The timeline, as written in earth, remains as immutable as stone. And so we must ask, why does evidence that challenges the story provoke such violent rejection? Why do the guardians of history respond to inconvenient truths, not with curiosity, but with fear? Perhaps because the implications are too vast. If humans or human-like beings stood in Mexico 250,000 years ago, then the entire human chronicle is not just incomplete. It is wrong. It is a mosaic with entire sections missing, stories erased by time or catastrophe, migrations lost beneath oceans or ice. It suggests waves of ancient explorers whose names are forgotten, whose bones are dust, whose technologies may have died with them. It suggests the Americas were not a destination reached once, but a frontier touched again and again by peoples older than memory. It suggests that the past did not crawl forward in a straight line, but moved in tides advancing, receding, rising again. And there is something else, too, something darker. When evidence contradicts a cherished narrative, institutions do not simply disagree. They erase, they bury, they silence. The story must remain stable, even if the ground beneath it trembles. Calico Valsequillo, other sites dateless, nameless, quietly catalogued and abandoned. Together they form the outline of a chapter, too ancient, too disruptive, too vast to be allowed entry into the canon. Yet every artifact, every stone flake, every hearth, every fossilized footprint whispers the same haunting truth. We are not the first to walk this land, and perhaps not even the second. Stand at these sites long enough, under the desert sun, or beside the volcanic cliffs, and the layers of time begin to peel away. You begin to sense unseen footsteps behind you, echoes of beings who lived and worked and vanished long before our species. Emerged from the cradle of Africa, their world is gone, but not erased. It lingers in sediments, in forgotten dig reports, in the stubborn resilience of facts that refuse to submit to dogma. The question now is not whether they were here. The question is, why did we insist for so long that they could not have been? The broken timeline of the Americas is not a flaw. It is a clue, a doorway into a past, more ancient, more complex, more improbable than we have ever dared to imagine. And beyond that doorway, the next mystery waits, carved into stone faces that stare out across an ocean. There are places in the ancient Americas where stone does not simply endure, it remembers. And nowhere is that memory more haunting, more defiant, more impossible to explain within the bounds of the Ixtacatl timeline than along the swampy Gulf Coast of Mexico, where the first great civilization of the region left behind its strangest legacy. 17 colossi, 17 silent witnesses. 17 faces carved into volcanic basalt so heavy that each one seems to anchor a forgotten world to the earth. The Olmec heads do not merely sit upon the land, they dominate it. Some weigh 20 tons, others 50. Their surfaces are worn by centuries of rain and jungle humidity, yet their features remain unmistakably human: stern brows, broad cheekbones, full lips, eyes that seem less carved than remembered. They stare outward with a presence that is unsettling, not because they are strange, but because they feel familiar, strangely familiar. For generations, scholars insisted these were stylized portraits of local rulers. The Olmec, they said, simply favored a particular artistic convention, a certain roundness of the face, a fullness of lip, a broadness of the nose. But conventions do not explain why these features align so closely with populations separated from Mesoamerica by nearly 6,000 miles of ocean. Conventions do not explain why these heads resemble not the indigenous peoples who followed the Olmec, but the faces of West Africa. From the moment the colossal heads were unearthed in the 19th century, the comparison has lingered like a shadow trailing behind the sunlight of academic certainty. Observers saw in their features the echoes of Nubian warriors, West African nobles, or voyagers from kingdoms lost to time. The idea seemed heretical, unthinkable. Africans in the Americas long before Columbus. Yet the stones stared back with quiet insistence, as if to say, "Look again." And so researchers looked. Some pointed to the craftsmanship, the precision of the carvings, the transportation of massive stone blocks across dozens of miles without wheels or beasts of burden. Such feats suggest a level of organization and engineering far beyond what the textbooks grant the Olmec as the so-called mother culture of Mesoamerica. Others pointed to the sculptures' helmets, strangely reminiscent of African ceremonial headgear. Still others noted that the Olmec seemed to appear suddenly in the archaeological record around 1600 BCE, their culture fully formed, their artistry mature, their monuments immense. Where did they learn these skills? Who taught them to carve stone with such mastery? Who helped them raise cities like San Lorenzo and La Venta, sites designed with axial precision, complex aqueducts, and a ceremonial order that reflects concepts seen in distant lands? The official answer is simple: they learned it themselves. No contact, no crossings, no forgotten exchanges. Humans, in the ancient world, we are told, were bound to their continents like trees to soil. But the evidence, like the stone faces, whispers otherwise. Consider a vessel made not of pottery or red, but of possibility. The Atlantic's currents do not flow randomly. They form predictable loops. A boat leaving West Africa, whether by intent or by accident, is carried naturally toward the coastlines of the Americas. Historical records note that African sailors, particularly from the Mali and Sai empires, were accomplished navigators who constructed vessels capable of long-distance travel. The currents themselves become a map, a bridge made not of ice but of water. If such crossings happened even rarely, they could leave cultural fingerprints. And across Mesoamerica, those fingerprints begin to appear in places no one expects. Some Olmec skeletal remains exhibit cranial shapes closer to African populations than indigenous ones, though such claims remain fiercely debated. Artistic motifs, such as serpentine deities, pyramid structures, and cosmological symbols bear uncanny parallels to the Nile Valley and West African traditions. Even linguistic traces, controversial but compelling, hint at borrowed words, shared roots, improbable connections. But perhaps the most unsettling detail is this: the Olmec faces do not resemble the faces of later Mesoamerican peoples. Not the Maya, not the Toltec, not the Aztec. They stand apart, monuments to a presence that does not flow naturally from the lineage of the land. If they are portraits, then they are portraits of someone else. The skeptical world bristles at this suggestion. not because the evidence is weak, but because the implications unravel too many tightly woven threads. If the Olmec inherited knowledge from African visitors, then the Americas were not isolated. If the colossal heads commemorate rulers of foreign descent, then human civilization was interconnected long before Columbus. And if transoceanic voyages were possible 3,000 years ago, then our assumptions about ancient navigation collapsed like abandoned pyramids beneath encroaching jungle. And yet the stones remain. They do not flinch under scrutiny. They do not apologize for their features. They simply observe a world that insists upon forgetting. Stand before an Olmec head, and the sensation is unmistakable. These were not whimsical creations or random effigies. They were deliberate, reverent, celebratory. They were meant to endure. Each one radiates the authority of a ruler whose presence shaped the fate of cities. Each one carries the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Someone remembered, someone honored, but remembered by whom? Perhaps the Olmec were not merely the mother culture of Mesoamerica, they may have been heirs to a tradition that began far across the ocean, or perhaps they were part of a story unfolding simultaneously on multiple continents, connected by winds, currents, and courage that history has refused to acknowledge. The colossal heads are silent, but silence is not the same as absence. Sometimes, silence is the loudest testimony of all. Through their unblinking eyes, the next layer of the mystery unfolds not beneath the earth, but in the sky. For the Olmec did not merely carve faces, they carved calendars, defined sacred space, and laid the foundation for a civilization obsessed with time, stars, and the architecture of the cosmos. And from that foundation rose a culture whose monuments still pulse with celestial fire. The Maya did not simply inherit from the Olmec, they amplified, they transformed, they reached upward, and in the depths of their temples lies a secret even stranger than stone giants. There are civilizations that speak in stone, and then there are civilizations that speak in starlight. The Maya did both. Their cities did not simply rise from the jungle, they aligned with it, harmonized with it, measured it as though the land were a vast instrument, and they were tuning each note. Step inside their world and you begin to feel something strange. The sense that these cities were not built for humans alone, but for an intelligence reaching in two directions at once, skyward and downward, toward realms beneath the earth we still barely understand. To walk through a Maya city at dawn is to witness architecture wrestling with the cosmos. Shadows fall in perfect geometric patterns. Temples catch the first light like mirrors angled toward the heavens. Every platform, every stair, every sightline seems to whisper of astronomical observation. But the most revealing moment comes not in movement, but in stillness when you stand before El Castillo at Chichen Itza as the equinox sun descends the pyramid's northern staircase and the shadow of a serpent ripples down stone steps carved thousands of years ago. The illusion is so precise, so elegant, that one cannot help but feel the builders were not merely marking a date. They were reenacting a cosmic truth. The Maya saw the universe as a layered creation, sky above, earth in the middle, and a deep underworld beneath, accessible not through metaphor but through architecture. Cenotes, vast sinkholes filled with clear, cold water, were believed to be portals to this realm. Some plunge hundreds of feet into the earth, lit by shafts of sunlight that pierce the darkness like beams from another world. These were not mere water sources, they were gateways. Beneath Chichen Itza itself lies a perfectly circular cenote, stretching into an abyss. Its edges lined with offerings, jade, gold, weapons, human remains. Not sacrifices born of brutality, but of devotion, gifts cast into the water for the gods below. To the Maya, the underworld was not a place of punishment. It was origin. It was destiny. It was home. This relationship between sky and underworld was not symbolic. It was engineered. And nowhere is this more enigmatic than in the tomb of Kanich Janab Pakul, the ruler of Palenque, whose sarcophagus lid remains one of the most debated artifacts in archaeology. Carved in exquisite detail, it depicts Paco reclining in a posture no ordinary human would assume, knees bent, arms extended, body tilted at an angle that suggests motion rather than rest. Surrounding him are flames, celestial symbols, and a device that some interpret as a stylized depiction of the Maya world tree, but to others, it resembles something else entirely. A control panel, a pilot's seat, a vessel descending or ascending, a king riding a cosmic engine into the heavens. The idea has been dismissed by scholars as modern projection, a case of ancient imagery filtered through contemporary imagination. Yet the impression persists, not because of fantasy, but because the image refuses to settle into a simpler interpretation. Pakal is not merely lying in state, he is departing. If the Maya saw death as a form of travel, then Pakal's tomb may be more than a burial site. It may be a map, a guide for the king's passage through realms both terrestrial and celestial. And if the Maya inherited their fascination with cosmic order from older cultures like the Olmec, then this tomb might be one link in a lineage stretching back to a time when knowledge flowed across oceans like tides. But the true measure of Maya genius lies in their mathematics. Zero, as a concept, did not appear in European mathematics until the Middle Ages, yet the Maya carved it into stone more than 1,000 years earlier, an oval-shaped glyph, elegant and simple, unlocking calculations that allowed them to track the movements of Venus with astonishing accuracy. They charted the planet's synodic cycle, 584 days, with a precision that modern astronomy verifies to be nearly perfect. Why Venus? Because in Maya cosmology, Venus was not just a point of light, it was an omen, a messenger, a cosmic clock whose rise and fall marked times of ritual, war, and kingship. But such precision suggests more than belief. It suggests observation, long, continuous, and methodical, the kind of dedication found not in nomads or simple farmers, but in a culture with a scientific tradition deep enough to transcend generations. Teotihuacan, though not Maya, echoes this same obsession with the stars. Its pyramids align with celestial bodies in ways that defy coincidence. The Avenue of the Dead points toward the setting of the Pleiades. The Pyramid of the Sun sits atop a massive cave system once regarded as the womb of creation, and the entire city, laid out in a grid, mimics the Orion constellation just as Giza does half a world away. Too many parallels, too many alignments, too many patterns repeating across civilizations that, according to official history, never met. But patterns do not lie. They repeat because something deeper connects them. Perhaps the most unsettling truth about the Maya is not their precision, or their architecture, or their mythology. It is how suddenly their world declined. Cities emptied. Temples fell silent. The stargazers vanished from their observatories. The great calendar cycles continued turning, but the people who once read them were gone. Famine, drought, war. These explanations feel too small, too neat, too mundane to extinguish a civilization that once wove time, space, and spirit into a unified tapestry. The fall of the Maya was not a collapse, it was a disappearance, as if the people simply stepped into the underworld they revered or followed a celestial path into a silence the world cannot penetrate. Yet their monuments remain still aligned, still breathing, still listening to the heavens. And as the jungle wraps its green fingers around stone, the mystery only deepens. What knowledge did the Maya inherit? What knowledge did they leave behind? What connection binds their cities to the sky, their cenotes to the deep, their tombs to a journey beyond death? The stars they charted have not changed. The sky they mapped still arches above us, and in that sky lies the next thread of the mystery, a thread leading to cities even older, even more enigmatic, built by hands we still fail to understand. There are cities that feel built for people scaled to human stride, shaped to human need. And then there are cities like Teotihuacan, where every stone seems measured for a being larger than life, more ancient than memory. Nothing about Teotihuacan feels accidental. Nothing about it feels improvised. It rises from the basin of central Mexico like a geometric apparition, a place where stone does not simply stand at commands. From the moment you step onto the Avenue of the Dead, the scale presses against you like a silent weight. The road is so broad it seems designed for a procession of giants. The pyramids do not feel like temples but ancient mathematical constructs forged from millions of tons of volcanic rock, humming with an eerie symmetry. And the alignment is too precise, too deliberate to be coincidence. The city's grid tilts 15.5 degrees off true north, matching the trajectory of celestial bodies that marked cosmic cycles across the heavens. The three main pyramids echo the stars of Orion's belt, mirroring a pattern found not only in Egypt, but in sacred sites across the world. It is as if Teotihuacan were not built to reflect the cosmos, but to communicate with it. But the mystery does not end with geometry. The identity of the builders remains unknown. By the time the Aztec civilization rose centuries later, the city was already ancient, abandoned, silent, and half claimed by the earth. The Aztecs gave it a name that reflects both awe and uncertainty. Teotihuacan, the place where gods were born. To them, the city was a relic of a divine age, built not by mortals but by beings who walked with the stars. What kind of civilization could raise monuments like these, then vanish without trace? The murals inside the city offer a glimpse, but not an explanation. They depict figures with goggled eyes and strange headdresses, warriors, priests, or perhaps something else entirely. They show serpents swirling around temples and spirals, each scale rendered with unsettling care. And deeper still, beneath layers of plaster and dust, archaeologists have found traces of something more enigmatic. Vast chambers beneath the Pyramid of the Sun filled with liquid mercury, glittering like a mirror reflecting a world below. Some call it a symbolic underworld. Others whisper of forgotten rituals, of access points meant not for the living, but for those who traversed realms beyond. The official story calls these interpretations fanciful, but the mercury remains. The tunnels remain. The silence remains. Teotihuacan was not alone in this pattern of cosmic ambition. Across Mesoamerica, cities rose and fell like mirages, each carrying fragments of an older knowledge. The Zapotecs carved entire mountains into ceremonial platforms, their cities connected through stone causeways that stretched for miles. Monte Alban, perched atop a ridge in Oaxaca, was aligned not for defense but for observation. Its plazas, angled precisely to watch the movements of the sun and stars. Its tombs were painted in spirals and crochetches that resembled maps, or perhaps diagrams of cycles long forgotten. And then there were the Toltecs, The Toltec world is shrouded in legend, their history half myth, half ruin, and entirely elusive. But one relic has outlived the turbulence of centuries. The warrior columns of Tula. These massive stone figures stand atop the pyramid of Talahuacalpantu, like guardians of a vanished age, broad-chested, wide-eyed, carved with weapons whose designs echo strange technologies. They do not look ceremonial, they look functional, as if the Toltecs remembered a time when war was waged with tools now lost to us. The Aztecs revered the Toltecs as keepers of ancient wisdom. They believed the Toltec capital was a place where knowledge was born, where science, art, and cosmic understanding blended into a single discipline. But like Teotihuacan, Tula fell, its columns weathered, its plazas emptied, its knowledge dissolved into myth. And still the cycle continued. The Aztecs themselves followed the same pattern, rising with unstoppable momentum, then collapsing with terrifying speed. Their empire stretched across mountains and valleys, their capital Tenochtitlan, shimmering upon a lake like a floating jewel. Their priests charted the heavens with an obsession that bordered on prophecy. They believed time moved in repeating cycles, each era ending in destruction and rebirth. To them, the world had died before and would die again. Perhaps that belief was not superstition. Perhaps it was inherited memory. When Hernan Cortes marched into the Valley of Mexico, he did not conquer a primitive people. He conquered the last inheritors of a tradition that reached back thousands of years, a tradition of astronomy, architecture, and cosmic reverence woven through every stone they carved. The Aztecs did not view Cortes as an intruder. They saw him as a figure from prophecy, the return of a pale-skinned being who had vanished long before. It is a cruel twist that prophecy led to the empire's downfall, as smallpox and steel crushed what had survived ages of triumph and collapse. But the deeper truth remains. Mesoamerican supercities did not rise in isolation. They rose in patterned cycles of creation and abandonment, construction and dissolution, as if guided by a rhythm beneath the surface of history. These cities felt less like human attempts to build monuments, and more like repetitions of an older blueprint whose origins lie beyond any single people. Stand at the base of the Pyramid of the Moon at dusk, and you can feel that rhythm. The sky grows heavy, the stones warm, then cool. The shadows stretch in perfect lines. The sensation is unmistakable. These cities were aligned not for convenience, but for communion. Something in them calls upward, something in them calls downward, and something in them whispers a truth modern history refuses to confront. The builders of these cities are remembered only in fragments. Their names are lost, their origins debated, their disappearance unexplained. Yet their cities remain monuments to a conversation with the cosmos that we no longer understand. And these are not the oldest. Beyond the jungles and deserts, high in the Andes, lie cities, even stranger places, where technology masquerades as magic, where the architecture bends reality, and where the impossible becomes merely the beginning. The farther south you travel, the more the Andes rise not as a mountain range, but as a continent unto themselves. Here, the world sharpens, air thins, horizons fracture into sawtoothed peaks. And in this impossible landscape, civilizations emerge that feel less like human societies, and more like echoes of something older. Something borrowed from a forgotten epoch. Our journey begins on the parched coast of Peru, in a place where civilization should never have blossomed. Here, in the Soup Valley, rises Carol, one of the oldest known cities in the Americas. It appears suddenly in history, as if conjured, around 3700 BCE, already sophisticated, already expansive, already grand. But what makes Carol unsettling is not what has been founded, is what has not. No carvings, no weapons, no murals, no fort. An entire civilization without war, without art, without fear or pride inscribed into stone. It is as if Carol were a skeleton of culture stripped down to its structural essences, though the people inherited knowledge instead of discovering it. And yet, its architecture hums with intelligence. Sunken circular plazas align with constellations. Pyramidal mounds create acoustic chambers where drums echo like thunder. Cotton fields fed fishermen miles away, forming a symbiosis so finely tuned it feels engineered rather than evolved. The absence of conflict is not a mystery, it is a challenge. How do you rise to complexity without ever raising a blade? How do you construct monumental cities without a single symbol of domination? Carol feels like a memory, like the fading afterimage of a world that fell long before history began. Far above Carol, in the highlands of the Andes, a different kind of world awaited, and it did not whisper, it roared. Chavindahuanto sits at over 10,000 feet, wrapped in cold mist and the sound of rushing rivers, a temple city built with precision that defies its age. It was not an empire, but a religious Enginan initiatory labyrinth, designed to rewrite the human mind. The corridors beneath the temple twist through the earth like veins, darkest where the walls funnel sound into deep, resonant vibrations. Archaeologists describe the acoustics as inhuman, the kind of echo that makes the listener unsure whether the sound comes from outside or inside their own skull. Imagine arriving here 2,000 years before the Common Era, guided through narrow tunnels as conch shells bellow like the calls of beasts. The stone god at the heart of the labyrinth, the Lanzon waits in the pitch black, a towering fanged being that blends human, feline, serpent, and eagle. And imagine meeting it while under the influence of the San Pedro cactus, a hallucinogenic ritualized by Chavan priests. What would you see? A god? A creature from myth? Or something else? Something passed down from a civilization even more ancient than this temple? Chavan was not merely spiritual. It was technical. Ventilation shafts disguised as sacred fissures, water channels creating roaring illusions, hidden chambers amplifying priestly voices. It is architecture weaponized into transcendence. Or, perhaps, into memory. When Chavín faded, its influence splintered across the Andes sand. From the shards rose the Nazca. The Nazca lived in one of the driest places on earth, yet their artistry burst with color ceramics painted in crimson, ochre, and obsidian black. And in the desert outside their cities, they carved messages so immense they can only be read from the sky. The Nazca lines stretch across the desert floor like the strokes of a cosmic brush. The hummingbird, the monkey, the spiral, the arrow straight lines that run for miles with impossible precision. The desert preserved them, but the question persists. Who were they for? To walk a Nazca line is to move through a ritual. To fly above them is to see a map. Some point to underground water sources, others to solstices and constellations, and some align with no celestial pattern at all. Eric von Däniken once asked whether they were runways for gods. Archaeologists answered that they were ceremonial pathways, but the truth may lie somewhere in between. In a place where ritual meets astronomy and geometry meets devotion, in a place where knowledge is not transmitted through writing, but through alignment through the positioning of land beneath sky, and then, beyond the desert and deep into the mountains, the greatest enigma of the Andes took form. The Inca. The Inca rose like a miracle in the 1400s, spreading across mountains and valleys with impossible speed, uniting millions under a single divine ruler. Their empire was woven together with roads so perfect that even today they cling to cliffs like threads of stone. Suspension bridges stretched across chasms where the air thinned to a whisper. Terraces climbed mountainsides like stairways built by giants. The citadel of Machu Picchu sits atop a ridge in architectural equilibrium stones, so precisely cut they seem to breathe into one another. But behind their engineering another mystery waits: quipu. To the untrained eye, a quipu is simply a bundle of knotted cords. But each knot holds meaning: numbers, dates, tributes, and now researchers believe some quipus contain syntax, narrative, even genealogy. These may not be counting tools at all. They may be an alien form of writing, a three-dimensional data storage system coded in colors and fiber density. If true, then the Inca were not a great civilization without writing, but the inventors of a linguistic system modern humans have barely begun to decrypt. Their downfall was as swift as their rise. Disease, civil war, and the iron of conquistadors shattered the empire in a span so short it feels unreal. Their libraries of quipu were burned, their priests silenced, their temples stripped. Knowledge that survived millennia vanished in decades. And yet, traces remain threaded into stones, encoded in chords, mirrored in cities still untouched by time. If the Andes reveal anything, it is that the Americas were never a wilderness waiting to be civilized. They were a crucible of ingenuity, a grand experiment in engineering, astronomy, ritual, and mathematics, one that emerged independently, flourished brilliantly, then collapsed beneath the weight of forces we still barely comprehend. But our journey through forgotten civilizations is not finished. For beyond the mountains and deserts, across the plains and forests, lies a land where cities rose in silence and disappeared without farewell. Their legacy is written not in mountain stone, but in earth, sky, and rumor. The story of ancient America does not end in the Andes, nor in the jungles of Mesoamerica. It stretches northward into forests that whisper, prairies that conceal abandoned earthworks, and canyons carved with the memory of those who built homes where no hand should have been able to reach. Here, in the rolling heartlands and stone alcoves of North America, civilizations unfolded that rivaled anything in the Old World, yet their existence is barely mentioned, their brilliance hidden beneath centuries of silence. The silence begins in a place that should not exist. Cahokia, on the fertile floodplains of the Mississippi River, opposite present-day St. Louis, rises a mound so vast it dwarfs imagination. Monk's Mound, as it is now called, is larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza Belt, not from limestone but from millions of tons of sculpted earth. And this was only the center. Around it sprawled a metropolis of 20,000 people at its peak, a population larger than London around the same time. In the cultural memory of the American heartland, Cahokia does not exist. Yet 1,000 years ago, its plazas roared with festivals. Its wooden temples blazed in the sun. Its astronomers stood within the ring of posts known today as Woodhenge, tracking solstices with a precision that suggested inherited knowledge, something older than Cahokia itself. There is no evidence of foreign invaders. No signs of war so catastrophic it raised a city of this scale. What remains is an ending without an explanation. Soil suddenly overworked, forests abruptly stripped, floods sweeping through like warnings from the earth itself. It was as if Cahokia burned too bright, too fast, like a star that consumes its fuel all at once. And just as abruptly as they rose, the people walked away, No records, no laments, no chronicles carved into stone. Only mounds staring skyward, waiting for a story that was never written. Far to the southwest, in a land of shattered mesas and endless blue sky, another mystery took form. The ancestral Puebloans did not build simple villages. They carved entire lives into the bones of cliffs. At Chaco Canyon, great houses emerged from the desert massive, multi-story complexes constructed with a precision that should have been impossible for the tools they possessed. Pueblo Bonito alone contained more than 600 rooms, arranged in a perfect shape, its walls aligned to the cardinal directions and solstitial arcs. Roads radiated outward from Chaco like spokes on a cosmic wheel, some disappearing straight into the desert for miles. Cutting across terrain with a geometry that mirrors the Nazca lines far to the south. Chaco was not simply a settlement, it was a ceremonial Harta place, where time itself was measured by sun, shadow, and silence. But like all sacred centers, its age of power did not last. After centuries of ritual gatherings and architectural brilliance, the weather turned. Drought clung to the land like an unshakable spirit, crops failed, rivers receded, and the people of Chaco began to disperse northward, eastward, outward. Their footsteps traced the same paths as their roads, carving the memory of an exodus into the desert floor. Their final astonishing creation came high in the cliffs of Mesa Verde and the canyons of the Four Corners. Cliff, palace, balcony house, spruce tree house, villages built in alcoves so high that one wonders how food, water, and timber were carried up. These were places of refuge, yet also places of astronomical alignment, where windows illuminated specific chamber walls only on solstice mornings. Imagine climbing the narrow hand and toehold trails with the canyon yawning below. Imagine stepping inside a kiva lit by a single shaft of sunlight, the air thick with sage and ceremony, and then imagine walking away forever. By 1300 CE, these cliff cities were empty, not conquered, not destroyed. Empty. The descendants of these people Hopi, Zuni, Akamateo stories, not of abandonment, but of fulfillment, of migrations long foretold, of cycles completed, of destinies moving onward. Yet the sudden emptiness of stone halls and silent kivas still chills the modern traveler. Cities do not disappear, but these did. The silence continues farther east and through the forests where earthworks twist into shapes of serpents, hundreds of feet long, where burial mounds rise like green pyramids, and where rivers hide traces of palisaded towns visited by the first European explorers. Each culture appears, flourishes, and vanishes like a breath, and the mystery grows deeper as we move toward the sea. Beyond the mainland, scattered like emeralds across turquoise water, lie the islands of the Caribbean, the world of the Taino, and the Caribs. These were not isolated islanders, but master navigators of dugout canoes carved from gigantic trees, capable of crossing hundreds of miles of open water. Their ceremonial plazas and stone-lined ball courts resembled those of the Maya, suggesting ancient connections now lost beneath colonial violence. But on the seafloor near Bimini, another secret lies waiting. Rectangular blocks of stone arranged like a road half a mile long, straight, purposeful. The Bimini Road. Geologists say it is natural. Others see evidence of shaping, of placement, of engineering. And deeper still, on the ocean floor off Cuba, sonar images captured structures at a depth so great they could only have been built when sea levels were far lower, structures that look unnervingly like city ruins. The Caribbean remembers what the land has forgotten. And through this tapestry of mystery, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The civilizations of North America did not exist in isolation. Their temples align with stasis. Their cities mirror cosmic rhythms. Their migrations echo prophecies. Their monuments point skyward as if in conversation with something beyond themselves. Yet for centuries, their achievements were dismissed in it because evidence was lacking. But because the narrative demanded a simpler past. But the earth does not keep secrets forever. And the next revelations come from contacts so ancient, so shocking, that they challenge not just archaeology, but the shape of human history itself. For across the oceans north, east, and west there are stories of travelers who reached the Americas long before Columbus. And some of those stories are no longer myths. Some have left bones, tools, DNA, and one left behind rumors of a royal fleet large enough to swallow a horizon. For centuries, the story of the Americas began in 1492. With 3 small ships slicing through the Atlantic and a man stepping onto unfamiliar shores. But every new discovery pushes that date backward, first by decades, then centuries, then millennia, till the horizon dissolves into a blur of forgotten crossings. The deeper we look, the more the oceans resemble highways rather than barriers. And the more human history begins to resemble a tapestry woven from journeys long denied. The first threads of this tapestry lie in the frozen north, where a cold wind carries the memory of lost boats. In the 1960s, archaeologists uncovered a cluster of turf-walled buildings at Lonzo Meadows in Newfoundland. Norse rings, iron nails, a forge, the unmistakable imprint of Viking settlement. The sagas told of a place called Vinland, where grapes grew wild and timber stretched for miles. A land reached by Leif Erikson around the year 1000. For centuries, scholars dismissed the tales as folklore. Yet the earth did not. The site at El Anso Meadows proved that Europeans crossed the Atlantic 500 years before Columbus saw a sail on the horizon. But the Vikings may only have brushed the edge of a much older story. Some scholars turned their eyes not toward the Middle Ages, but toward the Ice Age. The Solutrean hypothesis, a theory, as incendiary as it is intriguing, suggests that Paleolithic hunters from Europe may have followed the edge of the Atlantic ice sheet during the last glacial maximum using skin boats and knowledge of seals, ocean currents, and drifting ice. Their stone points resemble the earliest American spearheads with uncanny precision. Critics call it coincidence. Proponents call it inheritance. And the land, as always, offers silence broken only by the shape of stone tools uncovered in Virginia, Pennsylvania, and the eastern seaboard. The ocean did not wait for modern ships to be crossed. Across the sea in Ireland, medieval monks told the tale of St. Brendan, who set sail in a leather boat and wandered the oceans for 7 years, encountering strange shores and seas of fire. It was said to be spiritual allegory, and an explorer named Tim Severin reconstructed Brendan-S boat and sailed it from Ireland to Newfoundland. The voyage was not only possible, it was replicable. Suddenly the line between myth and map thinned, and the Atlantic seemed less like a wall and more like a memory. And then there are the shadows of the Knights Templar vanished after their sudden arrest in 1307. Their ships disappeared from the port of La Rochelle without a trace. Some say they fled to Scotland. Others claim they crossed the Atlantic, carrying relics, possibly even the Holy Grail hidden in the foundations of the Newport Tower or the booby-trapped shafts of Oak Island. There is no proof, only hints, symbols, motifs, architectural oddities. But mysteries survive because something in them refuses to die. Yet if Europe's contact with the Americas before Columbus is a contested forest of theories, Asia's connection is a labyrinth with branches stretching in all directions. On the coast of Ecuador, pottery from the Valdivia culture mirrors the swirling forms of Jomon ceramics from Japan. It is not merely stylistically similar, it is eerily so, almost as if the same hands taught both cultures. The prevailing current of the Pacific, the Kuroshio, flows straight from Japan toward the Americas. A lost fishing boat, an accidental drift, or even more daring, a deliberate voyage could have carried these techniques across thousands of miles. The artifacts whisper an undeniable truth. Someone made that journey, someone left instructions in clay. And farther west, in the courts of Ming China, Admiral Zheng he commanded fleets of treasure ships so large that they dwarfed European caravels like toys. Official history says these expeditions explored only the Indian Ocean, but unofficial maps, stray anchors, and half-told stories hint that some of his ships may have ventured farther, perhaps, as far as the Americas. The theory is disputed, dismissed, even mocked, yet every mystery carries a grain of possibility, and the Pacific is a vast keeper of secrets. But among all the claims of Asian contact, one stands firm-rooted in DNA rather than speculation. The Polynesians, masters of wayfinding, did not drift across the Pacific. They conquered it with intention and precision. Their double-hulled canoes sailed from Hawaii to New Zealand to Easter Island, navigating by stars, currents, and the color of the sea. For decades, scholars believed their expansion halted before touching the Americas. Then, in 2020, the world changed. Geneticists studying the DNA of indigenous peoples in Colombia found traces of Polynesian ancestor dating to around the year 1200. The discovery was not ambiguous. It was not theoretical. It was living proof. Polynesian voyagers reached South America, interacted with its people, and carried sweet potatoes kumara to the Polynesians, kumara to the Andean peoples back across the ocean. This was not a lost rumor. It was a recorded meeting carved into code. And suddenly the Pacific, long imagined as an insurmountable divide, became a bridge, a place where two worlds touched long before Europeans knew either existed. But of all the pre-Columbian crossings whispered through time, none carries the gravity or the scale of the voyage from Africa. On the western coast of the continent, in the heart of the Mali Empire, ruled a man whose curiosity eclipsed his crown. Abu Bakr, II, emperor of a land richer in gold than any kingdom on earth, launched not one but two monumental expeditions across the Atlantic. The first voyage vanished into a mysterious river in the sea, the powerful current that flows from Africa straight to the Americas. A single ship returned. The second expedition was different. Abu Bakr II stepped aboard himself. 2,000 ships, some filled with sailors, others with supplies, sailed into the west and never returned. The tale comes not from folklore but from the mouth of Mansa Musa, the most documented man in medieval Africa. And when Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, the Taino told him stories of black-skinned travelers who had come from the south and east, bearing metal-tipped spears made from an alloy identical to that of West Africa. What happened to the Mali fleet? No one knows. Perhaps they perished. Perhaps they reached the shores of Brazil or the Caribbean. Perhaps their descendants walked the Americas long before the first Spanish sails were sighted. And woven through all of this, Europe, Asia, Africa, one final whisper remains. The whisper of Atlantis. Not a single lost city, but a network. Not a fantasy, but a memory of a world drowned at the end of the Ice Age. Civilizations connected by currents, by stars, by shared myths of flood and fire. If the oceans were once highways, then the Americas were not isolated continents, they were crossroads, and the travelers who crossed them left traces not in textbooks, but in bones, in myths, in oddities that refused to be dismissed. This is the hinge upon which the past turns toward a final revelation that the Americas were never a world apart. They were the meeting place of worlds. And yet, the greatest voyage of all, the one that tears open the fabric of accepted history, is still ahead. For across the Atlantic sailed a fleet so vast it could darken the horizon, and its memory was almost erased.